portugués. Disculpe, no es posible de hablar español. Es muy difícil para mí, so unfortunately it is necessary to do this in English, but thank you for the opportunity. It is intriguing that I am Professor of Disasters and Health. I am half in a Disasters Institute at University College London in the United Kingdom, and half at a Health Institute at University College London. I'm also affiliated with the University of Agder in southern Norway. It is so exciting to have been given this opportunity by University College London to connect disasters and health, because we know in medicine they say prevention is better than cure. And in disasters, we also say prevention is better than cure. And that worked so well, didn't it? It really is awful what the world is going through. Whether any of you have experienced personal losses or personal sickness, the whole point of me connecting disasters and health was to try and avoid what we are experiencing. And it is tragic that we have over 4 million dead, and perhaps 10 times that amount with long COVID, possibly even more than that. And of course, people having their livelihoods, their lives, their opportunities shattered. It is also tragic that it was no natural disaster. It was all preventable. We knew exactly what to do. We knew exactly how to do it. There have been examples of how to deal with pandemics and disease long before myself or any of you were in this field. And yet we very clearly did not do what we should have done. This is the disaster. This is the tragedy. And this is what we are all here to hopefully really try and prevent, to show how prevention is better than cure. Which also means understanding what we're talking about. So we have the issue with language, and it is always a privilege to be able to speak English and to, ironically have the world come to us to speak English when there is so much more out there. But we are speaking English, and so we deal with these words. And the first word, of course, is disaster. We can go to dictionaries. We can try and translate it into all the languages which you speak and others. We can think of synonyms like catastrophe, calamity. But we are talking about disasters. So it's about going to dictionaries, going to glossaries, looking at laws, looking at legislation, and also looking at the academic literature. There are actually books written called What is a Disaster? So I went through them, and I tried to bring it down to as few words as possible. And what I came up with was hopefully a concept which works across cultures and languages, to say that a disaster is a situation requiring outside support for coping. That is really the fewest number of words that I could think of. There is some vagueness. Situation? What does coping really mean? And when we have a global disaster, what is outside support? To me, what works with this definition is that it can be individual, it can be family, it can be a town, or it can be a country, it can be the world. It also says, well, maybe there are some words that we should not use, like the one you see on the screen, accident, because no disaster is accidental. Because we know so much, because we can do so much, there should never be an accident. Except that I took this photograph in Geneva, and so this is actually French, accident, which means, again, if we're translating words, if we're translating across culture, does accident mean something different than accident in English? Does it have a different meaning, a different viewpoint, a different connotation? When we communicate, whether to ourselves or, like I say, my social media is in the chat, or writing books, or talking to people around us, or in scientific journals, choosing our words very carefully helps to communicate and helps to bring these messages that there are no natural disasters, that there should be no accidents, especially when there are different cultural approaches to what we mean by safe living, by health living, and as was mentioned in the introduction, what risk is and why people take risk. I took this photograph in Havana, and while we may say this is not a very good way of going about day-to-day life, we also understand why people may end up in this situation. We understand why they may feel they have no choice but to do these actions, and it may be that they are forced in many ways in order to act in this manner. This means that we have a lot of work to do to try to ensure that we can support people in any situation to deal with safety, to deal with health, and ultimately to be able to avoid a situation requiring outside support for coping, whether it is one individual who lost control of a car or a world which is caught up in a pandemic that we knew was coming and that we knew we could have stopped. Even if these concepts and ideas are straightforward, the fundamental idea of disaster is often not straightforward because it combines two very difficult concepts, the two words you see on the screen, hazard and vulnerability. These words are interesting. They are interesting because they are difficult, in that we cannot necessarily translate or explain them very carefully. So I want, if you're able, to put into the message examples of hazard. Just type possible examples of hazard which we may come across in our work, recognizing that hazard does not translate into Spanish. And my understanding, it does not translate into Portuguese. So in Spanish, it may be amenaza, which is threat. It may be peligro, which is danger. I've seen it sometimes as risco for risk, which is, again, one example of how we may not be able to take what we understand to be a fairly straightforward English word and bring it across different cultures, different languages. But nonetheless, hazard. Put some examples of hazard in the chat so we can try and build up some examples of what a disaster might be. And it is the same with vulnerability. So vulnerability does not translate across many languages or cultures. It definitely works in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Norwegian, but many other languages outside of the Indo-European group do not translate vulnerability. So examples of hazard are obviously what happened in Alaska yesterday, an earthquake followed by a tsunami warning. Hazard, certainly what we've talked about in terms of virus and other possible microbes and other possible microorganism pathogens. Landslides, storms. It is hurricane season in the North Atlantic and Caribbean at the moment. Yes, we have fires in the messages right now, so absolutely. Or sort of as a photo from the slide, definitely where water gets to be where it should not. And that is sort of a flood coming through a house. It's interesting that in this photo, and I took this photo in Northern England, the disaster is not so much that it rained a lot and the water rose. The disaster is that there was a house in the way of the water. So rain is a hazard or potential hazard, not a disaster. Flood is a hazard or potential hazard, but not a disaster. It's only when the second aspect, the final word on that slide, vulnerability, comes in because we put a house there and the house is not flood resistant. Maybe people were living on the ground floor because they have disabilities and cannot climb stairs easily, and without a warning, they then got wet, maybe even had major problems, like we saw in Western Europe over the past few weeks, with dozens killed in Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, Luxembourg, even though they had days of warning. Days of warning there was going to be major rainfall. Every single place that was flooded, which I looked at, has a long history of flooding. Flooding centuries ago, flooding decades ago, flooding years ago. And yet still people are saying this was a surprise. How could this happen? Should this really be happening in a supposedly rich country? Well, when you live by a river, when you have flooded before, and when you are told 24 to 72 or 96 hours in advance that there's going to be a lot of rain, and we do nothing, we are going to have a disaster. So this is the difference between hazard, risk, and disaster. This is why vulnerability has to be there. Without vulnerability, there is no problem. And this illustrates why these floods in Europe were not a natural disaster, why the river flowing through that house was not a natural disaster, why everything that we've been talking about, and again in the chat, floods, earthquakes, fires as hazards, none of those have to be a disaster. Because we know what to do. Earthquakes are actually an excellent example. We have so many earthquakes which were huge and did not cause much damage, as opposed to more moderate earthquakes which led to a disaster. Again, even in Alaska yesterday, that was above 8 and very shallow. That is huge. You are going to feel it, and you can go on Twitter and see some fairly scary videos, but there was no disaster. Similarly, we can go back to, for example, 2003, and 22 December 2003, there was a fairly moderate earthquake. I mean, you would feel it. It was sort of 6.5 at 8 kilometers depth in California, and 2 people died. So what happened is a shaking started, they ran outside, and a clock tower fell on them and killed them. The owner of that building was found legally liable for their deaths because it had not been retrofitted. So that's fairly small death toll, 2 people, both of which should have been prevented. 4 days later, 26 December 2003, 6.7 at 10 kilometers depth, so very similar to California, which was 6.5 to 8 kilometers. So 6.7, 10 kilometers depth in southern Iran. Not 2 people, but 25,000 people died. California and Iran illustrate the difference between a hazard and a disaster. The difference coming from vulnerability. That California had learned that they need to have seismic building codes, and Iran also knew they were in a seismic zone. In fact, Iran has some of the best earthquake engineers and best seismologists in the world, but we still had a disaster because vulnerability was not reduced. So disasters are not natural because we know how to deal with hazards if we choose, whether it's a flood, whether it's an earthquake, whether it's a fire, whether it's a virus. The problem is that we do not necessarily choose. We end up creating vulnerability. We end up creating vulnerability for other people. And exactly as has kindly been put in the chat, we then end up with disaster by choice. But whose choice? Because not everyone who died in Iran, not everyone who's died from COVID-19 had a choice. They were forced into vulnerable situations by other people making choices for them, which created their vulnerability and which created risk. And so this is really the premise of saying disaster by choice, because someone somewhere is making decisions. Someone somewhere is saying, oh, I don't care if I make you vulnerable. You can just go and live in that floodplain. Or you know what, I want to make a bit of money, so I'm just going to put a development in a floodplain, or I'm just going to build an apartment block without earthquake resistance, take my money and walk away. You know, if a flood or earthquake happens in the next 6 months, maybe I'll be in trouble, but I'll gamble and maybe it will happen in 5 years and then people will have forgotten, so I get my money, they get killed, and I've made that choice to make them vulnerable. I have made my choice to create that disaster for other people. That is the disaster by choice. And that is what we are trying to stop. So for earthquakes, many people who focus on earthquakes say, you know what? If we want to say how many people have been killed by earthquakes, how many people have been killed by earthquakes? The answer is 0. They are not killed by earthquakes. They are killed by collapsing buildings. So earthquakes don't kill people, our choices do. The earthquake disaster is not natural. Trying to get this message across is not always easy. We are trained to think of hazard. We are trained to blame nature, and we are trained not to take responsibility. As soon as we say earthquakes do not kill people, collapsing buildings do, we must take responsibility for not having buildings collapsing. We have to have planning regulations, we have to have building codes, we have to have monitoring, we have to have inspections, we have to have a society which values all of those. We have to pay our inspectors and engineers and planners and architects enough money that they do not feel compelled to take bribes. We need to respect them as professions and ensure that when someone does break a code, they can be taken to court, prosecuted, if they're guilty, convicted, and punished without, again, bribes or corruption, and without someone going to the lawyer's house one day and killing them to stop the trial. So it's not just about the technical, it is about these wider social aspects. And exactly as Rodolfo has put into the chat, calling them natural disasters then transfers responsibility. It takes it away. And what a brilliant phrase in just one very short sentence. These are the communication aspects we need. Definition of disaster I gave. Disaster by choice, or Rodolfo's point, that it's simply about transferring responsibility. This argument is easily applied to the pandemic and to all the other hazards we mentioned. It also, interestingly, applies to something which is very much on our minds and often dominates all disaster topics, that of climate change. So if we're looking at what climate change does, and why climate change does not cause disasters, with some exceptions, but in general it does not cause disasters, it's a very straightforward argument coming from hazard and vulnerability. Climate, by definition, is average weather. Weather statistics, typically over 30 years, they're talking about changing to 20, but basically you take rainfall, you take wind, you take other weather, average the numbers over 30 years, that is climate, that's definitional. And climate change is defined as a change in climate, which is logical. So climate change is simply the weather changing. But weather is hazard. If we can stay out of the rain, we are not going to get wet. If we are forced to go to work in the fields when it's raining, we are going to get wet. If we can afford good windows and good walls and a good roof on our house, rain doesn't matter. If we cannot, rain matters. And it's the same with floods. So we know that we are changing the climate. It is actually so frustrating how rapidly and substantially We are affecting the globe through our actions, one example of which is climate change, changing weather over time. So the air is getting warmer. Warmer air holds more rain. When it rains more intensely. And that is human-caused climate change. But rain in itself does not necessarily cause a flood. There are many factors. Where does the water go? Can it run off into a river or the ocean? What is a soil saturation? Which means that you have a smaller arrow between the amount of rain and the floods. But floods, rain are only hazard. We have to have vulnerability to get the disaster, which means that more floods, worse floods, may or may not lead to more disasters or worse disasters. We do not know because we make that choice. So, the past 2 weeks, I've done so many media interviews trying to say, oh, the Western European floods, the fires in the US and Canada, is this climate change? Is this climate change? Simple message, the floods and the fires, yes, were probably very likely affected by human-caused climate change. We are seeing the signal of what we are doing now. But the disaster had no connection to climate change. These places have burned before. These places have flooded before. The question marks are in the slide for a reason, because more, worse, more intense, more frequent floods, storms, fires, whatever, do not need to mean more disasters. There is very poor correlation between our observations of climate change and weather-related disasters, because there is very poor correlation between weather, which is hazard, and disasters. And it's interesting trying to communicate this. So I did sort of suggest to some media that maybe we want some articles along this line. And some of the left-wing media, they just weren't interested because their story is climate change is killing us all. But fortunately, one editor in the Washington Post really thought that getting science to the public is important. So I put in the messages the article in the Washington Post, which basically says, yes, climate change is happening, but don't make this cause disasters. Yet there are exceptions. And those exceptions are terrifying. One big exception is actually the other aspect which was in the news, that of heat. Western Canada, Western US experience temperatures which, if they continue, we cannot survive. Heat waves kill a lot of people. Chicago 95, Paris 2003. In all of those cases, previous cases, heat is a hazard. People die because of vulnerability. They cannot afford fans. They cannot afford air conditioning. They are socially isolated, so no one is checking on them. Children and the elderly deal with heat much worse than adults. Most of the people who died in Chicago 95, Paris 2003 were elderly. So this is all vulnerability. It's nothing to do with the heat. It's all about disasters not being natural. What climate change is doing now, it is pushing heat into places where with humidity, we cannot survive. So no matter what your age, if you are not inside with artificial cooling all the time, you are dead. Again, not everyone can afford artificial cooling. Not everyone wants to be inside 24/7. Well, I guess we've had practice with lockdowns now. And some people are forced to go to work. If you are an agricultural laborer, if you are a construction worker, even if you are in an air-conditioned office but have to walk to work, we are getting to the point where the heat and humidity will kill you, and there's nothing that can be done. It is particularly bad without air conditioning if it does not cool down at night. Even in temperatures of 45, 50, if we're outdoors for a couple of hours, if we're fit, if we drink water, if we have a hat, we will probably survive. But it's only because we can cool down after that couple of hours. If we're talking 30, 35, 40 at night, without artificial cooling, then the deaths start to increase because our bodies don't adjust, and eventually our organs just fail and we die from heat. So when climate change starts making where I live, London, 40 degrees Celsius, when Melbourne or Manama, or where all of you are, start hitting 40 or 45 or 50, this is a disaster caused by the hazard caused by climate change. Again, without 24/7 cooling, there is nothing we can do. There is no way to reduce vulnerability. So heat humidity from climate change is one huge challenge. We are going to see thousands of deaths, if not more, directly attributable to climate change. This is one of the few examples of migration which can be linked to climate change. You know, there's a whole lot of discussion on climate refugees and climate migrants. It's wrong. But when we start hitting temperatures like that, then the choice is migrate or die. And this is directly linked to climate change. The other phrase on the slide, sea level rise, is a bit more difficult. So we know that there are different mechanisms of sea level rise. Most of them are not a problem. We're looking at a maximum of 2 meters sea level rise by the end of the century, by the year 2100. We get tides, which are higher than that. And about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, sea level was 2 meters higher than today. So by most of the mechanisms of sea level rise, it's about vulnerability, it's not about hazard, it's not about climate change. The difference between now and 4,000 years ago was we now have megacities right on the coast at low level, which includes London, includes New York, and Jakarta, and Lagos. So the difference between millennia ago and now is we have built in places which will then become part of the ocean. So again, that's our choice. That's vulnerability. The real difficulty with sea level rise is if the Antarctic ice sheet melts or if the Greenland ice sheets melt. Then we are looking at what, 40 meters, 50 meters, 60 meters of sea level rise? About 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago during the Ice Age, sea levels were about 100 meters lower than today because all that water was in the ice. Ice Age ended, modern humanity came out. We have never seen any change like 40, 50 meters of sea level rise for a long, long time. This is where the disaster might come from climate change because of where we've built and because of the fact that so much land will be flooded. Conversely, if the Antarctic or Greenland ice sheets melt entirely, we should know in about 60 years that it's happening, about 2080. And they'll probably take 200, 300, 400 years to melt. So we have 100 years to prepare. We have a century to prepare. Think back to the world a century ago. Very different from today. If we do not prepare for 50 meters of sea level rise in 100 years, do we blame climate change or do we blame us? Another aspect which is interesting is I mentioned the ice ages. They came because the Earth's orbit changes and it changes naturally. So ice ages move in and out according to how the Earth goes around the sun. By the time we're talking centuries, these orbital cycles start coming in. And so they will actually change the Earth's climate anyway. So these are kind of the balances of trying to blame everything on climate change. And yes, please do put questions in the chat. I'm happy to respond to them as we go along, like the comment there, which, yeah, actually says, oh, maybe you don't need me up here talking, because a lot of these points in that comment are about it. It's strengthening us at the community level, yes, but also at the national and international level. and at the household and individual level. Again, those of us who have choices, those of us who are privileged to be able to sit on the internet and interact with each other, we have options to avoid disasters. Most of the world does not. So we do then have to strengthen those movements. We do need to bring the new knowledge which is mentioned to them, but produce knowledge with them. It's not just, one way in that sense. It's working with people on their terms to ask them what do they need, what don't they have, and then as that comment concludes, in terms of new ways of going about life, which deal with vulnerability and which ensure that a hazard does not become a disaster. So the question from Carolina, well, find out how to communicate best with them. The way I'm talking now, going back and forth with slides, trying to interact, if that works, do it. If it doesn't, don't. If writing a book will get to public managers, do it. If they're not going to read English, and why should they in Brazil or many other places, then obviously don't write in English. Same with my social media and my blog. Almost all my writing is in English. Most of what I put on social media is in English, sometimes in other languages. But we have to understand whether the public managers speak other languages, whether they will read a tweet or a book, whether they want a face-to-face meeting or an online lecture, and just bring the very simple messages, which if they question, then you can give them more. So it's easy to say, it's easy to encapsulate it very succinctly. Disasters are not natural because they come from vulnerability. Where and how we live, and what we force other people to do. Straightforward. Now, we know all the responses. It can become political, it can become ideological, but if they respond, they're engaging, and then you can provide them with more. Do they want a blog? Do they want a scientific paper? Do they want 30 minutes with you? So the key to that question is find out what they need, what is best to communicate with them, and respond to that. If, as sort of the next paragraph goes on, they're focused on prevention and risks, maybe that's the way in. Maybe it's not, oh no, disaster happened, oh, but it's not natural. Maybe it's not, people say climate change causes disasters, but it doesn't really. Maybe those aren't the appropriate ways in. Maybe the appropriate way in is what's said about prevention and risks. And how's this happening in Europe today? I mean, why shouldn't it? We're as bad as everyone else. I mean, the whole construct of, Brazil is a developing poor country, and the UK is so wonderful because it's rich and developed. The UK has one of the most corrupt banking sectors in the world. When we look at the details of how the pandemic has been handled in the UK, again, the word corruption comes up. Our health minister had to resign because he was caught breaking his own lockdown regulations. One of the government's chief scientists had to move away from one of his positions because he was caught breaking the regulations he recommended. We should not be saying the UK and Europe are wonderful and Brazil and South America are terrible. We all have our problems, we all have so much to offer. I do not use the categories poor and rich countries. I do not use the categories developing countries. I do not use the categories underdeveloped, north-south, third world. They make no sense. There are places in London which are poorer than places in Rio de Janeiro. If we look at macroeconomic statistics, there may be some differentiation, but we also know that macroeconomic statistics are a very poor measure of how the population is doing. What happened in Europe a few weeks ago was a small disaster. Give it another decade, we are going to see so much worse. So we need to come together We need to support each other and recognize that we are all have the prospect of catastrophe, and we are all working together to stop this happening, in the same way that maybe I can help you in Brazil, but only if you help me in the UK. This is about exchange. This is about working together, not saying that, oh, one country is better than the other, but saying we all have plenty to offer, we all have successes, and we all have catastrophic failures. So someone has to leave, so I'll go to that question immediately. We said evaluate the model and show the accentuation of some, but not all hazards. What should PAR model look like today? Okay, well, if you can wait 2 years, we're going to publish it. So we're actually working on a revision right now with Ben Wisner and with JC Galliard and a few other colleagues. I don't have the answer because we don't know, but we are working on it, and we're definitely going to be trying to push forward the PAR model much more radically and do much more with it. So yeah, it's really about sort of waiting a couple of years, and hopefully we'll get that book out, and then you can criticize it and say what we did wrong and how we can improve. So then back up the chat. For many people, it's easier to say natural disaster. Yeah, I mean, Hamankar's point is actually very well taken, and we struggle with this. What I do is I just call it disaster. So the phrase disaster related to natural phenomena, or disaster related to earthquakes, or disaster coming from floods, yeah, it's not good, and it's true. I just call it disaster. I have no reason to differentiate, because all disasters come from vulnerabilities. That is the cause. So we did play around with sort of phrases like that, and in the end, keep it simple. Again, you know, it's not disaster related to natural phenomena by choice. Is disaster by choice. Keep it simple. And that helps with translation, that helps with communication. And it helps with engagement, because people will say, but yeah, you know, a riot is different from a landslide. It's like, yes, it is. But here's why they both come from vulnerabilities. Here's why they both come from fundamental social issues. Here's why we can deal with both of them simultaneously through the same measures. Again, it sort of engages, it really helps. And yeah, the media headlines are troublesome. As I mentioned earlier, I'm really struggling to get to certain media the message that climate change does not cause disasters. I'm really struggling to get to media that calling it the climate crisis, calling it the climate emergency is counterproductive, dangerous, and removes responsibility. Some of them are so ideological. There's a magazine called The Ecologist, which says that it does science, but they force authors to use a dramatic, alarmist vocabulary guide, which is written by an ideological journalist. It's like they're not even using the IPCC glossary. They're making it political by how they tell their authors to write, rather than recognizing that, yes, everything is political, but let's start with the science. So again, anything you can do in the media, you know, it's not just, what did Carolina say, public managers. It's not just public managers. It's media, it's journalists, it's professional communicators. Because this is a real problem. Even, you know, Luciana, why not respond saying, no, the heavy rains did not kill them, vulnerabilities did. You know, we've tried that, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You know, journalists get a lot of flack, so obviously they're not going to respond to everything. I do get responses to private messages sometimes, and a lot of journalists have actually, in live interviews also, have responded saying, oh, you know what? I'm going to stop using the phrase natural disaster. Together we can have the impact. And remember, I'm doing this in primarily English. You can spread out to many, many other languages. So what do I think about scientists that insist to approach disasters as natural phenomena? Well, same answers with journalists and with public managers. Talk to them, engage them. I've had a couple of Twitter exchanges recently where they say, okay, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not really convinced. So I said, let's have a chat. They don't reply. Okay, you know, they've got the idea, they don't want to talk about it, fair enough. Maybe the third time, they'll be convinced. Maybe they'll find me at a conference. We'll go and have, you know, a juice or beer together and work it out. I've had so many wonderful, wonderful conversations with scientists who respond exactly as Ricardo said on conference field trips. So, you know, you're walking up a volcano, it's half an hour to get there. Volcanologist approaches me and says, tell me again why disasters aren't natural. So I go through the same discussion, and bit by bit, we can get there. And you can join us. You can be part of it. So please do. And yeah, I mean, Sergio's comment, this is what we're up against. But we can deal with it. We have the arguments. We have the science. And it's up to them to say that they want 50,000 words of papers or they want one tweet. What works best for them. The other way of all this communication, which I'm hoping it's working, but really you can tell me, is again simplifying. So this whole notion of how to deal with climate change, because exactly as Sergio said, climate change is being naturalized through climate crisis, climate emergency. Climate change is an existential crisis. We're all going to die. Well, let's bring things together. Rather than making it this versus this, rather than saying you're wrong, I'm right, can we actually say, no, hang on. Let's look at some commonalities. Let's see what actually works and what we can all agree on. So I started with the definition of climate change, and everyone agrees on that. It's in the IPCC, it's in other UN bodies. What does this actually mean? Well, you note that I'm calling this dealing with disasters rather than disaster risk reduction. You note also the complicated phrase climate change adaptation and the question, well, what does climate change bring which is new? Why is climate change adaptation different than disaster risk reduction dealing with disasters? And let's keep it simple. So definition. Climate change by definition changes weather. Therefore, climate change adaptation deals with only climate. And maybe there are ways of simplifying even further, right? So how can we do better? Conversely, dealing with disasters deals with all hazards, which includes climate. So by definition, dealing with disasters encompasses climate change adaptation. Same. Climate, by definition, is weather averaged over 30 years, maybe 20, but at the moment 30. Therefore, it is long-term, medium-term, long-term only. Dealing with disasters covers all timescales, and this is by definition. If we go to the definition of disaster, any definition of disaster, if we go to disaster risk reduction, time is rarely there. And certainly my approach, a situation requiring outside support for coping, has no time element. Very deliberate. For some reason, climate change people are creating the myth that disaster risk reduction is not long-term. By definition, that's a ridiculous statement. If we are not thinking long-term, it's not disaster risk reduction. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So by definition, dealing with disasters covers climate change adaptation on a time scale. And then the final one is that disaster risk reduction looks at this interplay between hazard and vulnerability. It's about saying, what does society do to the environment? What does the environment do to society? How do they interact? What about the fact they are never separate? Whereas climate change adaptation, the definition, is that we are responding to actual or expected climate stimuli. That is, the environment does something when we respond. So by simplifying it in this table, it shows from the definitions, dealing with disasters covers everything climate change adaptation does and more. This should not be climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. This should not be, how do they overlap? How do they link? Climate change adaptation sits within dealing with disasters, and that's by definition, by simplifying in this table. So, what can we do in order to come up with something which brings everything together And I don't know, people like circles, people like colors, unless you're colorblind, I guess. So keep it simple. Yellow, climate change adaptation, is a subset of disaster risk reduction. And this is by definition. I mean, I've asked so many people, give me an example of climate change adaptation which was not in the disaster literature before climate change. So we're talking 80s or before, 1980s or before. They give me an example, I find a disaster paper. They give me another example, I find another disaster paper. This is verifiable. Same, climate change mitigation is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and absorbing them. Go back to the science and practice of preventing pollution from the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's all there. So greenhouse gases are pollutants. Pollution prevention includes, but is not limited to, climate change mitigation. If we do not adopt this approach, we create problems. Imagine that we build a school or a hospital, which is perfectly suited to climate change. So it's off-grid for energy, so we're not polluting with greenhouse gases. It's out of a floodplain expected to expand because of climate change, and it has wind and rain measures. So we've done everything for climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. But then we find asbestos used for fire resistance. We have not done pollution prevention. And then it collapses in the next earthquake. We've not done disaster risk reduction. If we do pollution prevention, we avoid asbestos and we take it off-grid. If we do disaster risk reduction, we've dealt with the earthquake, wind, water, landslide, virus, fire, everything. But of course, it cannot stop there, as you see by the blue circle. So let's say we have a perfectly hazard-resistant and vulnerability-reducing school or hospital. No pollution, it's not going to collapse or be a danger to anyone, but girls are not permitted to attend the school. Or anyone who goes to the hospital has to pay. We are not dealing with sustainability. We are not dealing with development. We are not dealing with health. This means that disaster risk reduction is not the final part. We need to think bigger, we need to think broader and bring everything together, which again, I've managed to get on one slide. It would also be easy to reduce the number of words on that slide if we wanted to. I'm sure you could as I can. So this communication is, let's keep stuff simple and straightforward. Let's start with definitions and put things in a very easy comparative manner, and hopefully go forward from then in order to try and implement all these aspects that we are doing. And some very key, some very straightforward messages to start the conversation. Disasters are not natural. The environment does not cause disasters. Disasters come from vulnerability. Vulnerability is a long-term process. It takes a while to build up. Since disasters are caused by vulnerability, and vulnerability is a long-term process, disasters are a long-term process. In the same way that we do not want to say natural disaster, we do not want to say fast onset disaster. All disasters happen slowly. No disasters happen quickly. Even when the hazard happens quickly, like an earthquake or tornado, the disaster took a long time to create the deaths and the damage. So disasters are not natural. Disasters are not events. Disasters do not happen quickly. And finally, and then hopefully you'll have plenty of questions, I'm looking forward to the discussion, it is not just about disaster risk. The key is very much the blue circle. Because there are more risks than disasters. And I saw Rodolfo has left, but in response to the PAR, We're hoping to revise PAR to start from the foundations, to start from the blue, not the green, and definitely not the yellow. Starting at the yellow is a huge, huge mistake. But a lot of us have started from the green, and we're now hoping to bring concepts of vulnerability much more detailed in order to start with the blue. In the context that on the screen, don't drink and drive because a funeral home has your size. And if we think about everyday risks, if we think about everyday dangers, these are the everyday disasters. Car crashes, drinking and driving, drugs, crime, assault, inequity, marginalization, corruption, oppression. I'm so fortunate that no matter what I say today, no matter what I say here, no matter what goes on YouTube, okay, thank you, Claudia, thanks for being part of it. I can sleep well tonight because no one is going to kick my door in at 3 a.m. and beat me up, torture me, arrest me, throw me into prison for without charge, without trial. No one is going to do that in this country. That is a privilege. Most people do not have that privilege. This is the everyday disaster. This is the everyday risk. This is what we need to think about in all our work and in our communication. So yes, the 10,000 people dying in a heat wave from climate change, the 1 million people dying when an earthquake hits a megacity, but also the fact that a woman was assaulted and murdered by a police officer in London a few months ago. That is unacceptable. It is as unacceptable as building an apartment building in a seismic zone without earthquake-resistant measures. The fact that children risk their lives to cross the road to get to school. The fact that many people cannot say what I'm saying because they know they will be dead within a week. This is why we are creating the everyday and the millennial scale disasters. This is why it is up to us to try and use what we have, what we can, to ensure that everyone is making the choices according to their own power and resources. And this is why, ultimately, very few disasters can be called natural. Obrigado, muchas gracias, thank you. Hoping we can now get some questions, discussion, challenges. I'm looking forward to your thoughts, looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Ilan. Thank you. We are all amazing. It was an amazing speech of yours. We are full of ideas, full of, I think guys in the audience are full of questions. You respond some of them. If guys are 2 or 3 more questions to finish our activity, feel free. Pessoal, se vocês tiverem mais 2 ou 3 perguntas antes de finalizar a atividade de hoje, por favor, ponham no chat.
Seria possível de escrever em português, espanhol, francês?
Yeah.
The role of capitalist systems, yeah.
Miguel.
Yeah, these economic and political ideologies are very much one of the fundaments. Capitalism itself is often said to be the criminal, but when we look at capitalism in theory, it is as perfect as communism is in theory. Communism did not do too well in practice and fortunately faded out. Capitalism is not doing too well in practice either. The issue to me is not how capitalist or how communist. The issue to me is not what particular ideology, or can we put, Western thought is destroying us all, which to me isn't a very sensible statement. It's more about how does the theory go wrong in practice? What is the real issue? To me, what our modern economic systems have done is increased inequity, increased inequality, and let large amounts of resources be accumulated with few individuals. That is the problem. That creates vulnerabilities. So is part of it capitalism? Yeah. But communism gave us nothing more. In the communist countries, large amounts of resources also accumulated with few amounts of individuals. One of Brazil's most prominent socialist presidents, is, I guess, enjoying prison at the moment, or not, as the case may be. So ideology creates these problems, but to blame a theory or to blame an ideology, to me, is not as robust as looking at what's going wrong in practice. And the reality is we have all the money we need to help people, and that money is sending billionaires almost into space for 10 minutes and is being used to buy huge yachts and huge airplanes, which just a couple of people use. So to me, it's the practice, it's the reality of these inequities, of these inequalities, of which, yeah, modern capitalism is definitely part of it, but it cannot explain the full story any more than Europeanization or Western thought does or can explain the whole story. But, feel free to disagree, even unmute yourself, and maybe I'm making mistakes, because I don't get everything right. There are actually 3 factual errors in the book, which we will hopefully correct in the paperback edition. And we need everyone inputting, we need everyone discussing, because I make mistakes. And I certainly do not know everything. Surprise.
Thank you, Ilan. I have a question. For you, Ilan, COVID-19 put a lot of people in a line of poverty in Brazil, all over the world. How we could approach disaster risk reduction in our researches, in our works for now on? I mean, after the pandemics, how we could approach this issue, this subject after the pandemics, in your point of view?
Yeah, I hope we will, because we know what to do. We knew what to do before the pandemic. I think our challenge at the moment actually came up in the questions about communication. So we've been doing what we can and getting the messages out there that the pandemic did not have to happen, that we can try and respond in a much better way, that will do better post-pandemic. That all the root causes of the pandemic are the same when we call it an earthquake disaster or climate change or riot. So it's about saying, we know what to do, let's communicate these messages to the decision makers, hoping we will do it. The sad aspect is that, as happens in most disasters, inequities have increased, inequalities have increased. Those who have power, resources, and advantages have very much used the pandemic to get even more power, resources, and advantages. So we hate ambulance chasing. I mean, we hate saying, oh, great, the pandemic's an opportunity, now let's do better. The amount of media attention we have had, why can't we get this before? And again, same with the floods and fires and heat over the past few weeks. Like, why don't journalists call me before there's a problem? And I have pitched to them articles on prevention, and there's not a lot of interest. So what do? I talk to the public managers, talk to the journalists, talk to each other, continue writing, continue speaking. Get the message out there, this shouldn't have happened. We know what to do to prevent it happening again. Is that a question from Alice, or am I misunderstanding?
It's just a comment. Congratulations for your speech. He's commenting that you are polyglot.
Oh, no, not quite. I can give a presentation in one language.
It's a compliment.
Yes. No, but in reality, I can give a presentation in one language.
Okay. So we have...
Yep. Would it be possible
the last one from Rafaela.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting. We debate this all the time. Number one, should it be voluntary, which Sendai Framework is? But on the other hand, the climate change accords have included legally binding aspects, and they've done no more than the voluntary aspects. Number two, should it be at a country level? Are country governments really the appropriate mechanism for so much effort? I like to see balance. I'm very worried that so much has gone into the international efforts of Sendai, Paris, before that Kyoto, the Sustainable Development Goals, before that the Millennium Development Goals, because we are losing out on the local, on the household, on the individual, on the community, on the regional. I will never throw out the national and international efforts. I think they bring some good attention, they have some good measures. I am concerned that so much attention is put into them. And the other problem that we have with these agreements, like the Sustainable Development Goals, like the Sendai Framework, like the Paris Agreement, is they are only as good as the members. And we know that the members of governments are not good enough. So there's been many analyses, actually I'll put some in the chat, I think I can bring them up fairly quickly. There have been many analyses of what Sendai does not do, but it's actually more of what Sendai cannot do, because it's multilateral. And it's same with, so there I've got that into the chat. And it's the same with the Paris Agreement. Even if every single country met their Paris Agreement voluntary obligations, we would not meet the target in the Paris Agreement. This is simply the system. Countries don't want to do much, and so they pretend we've signed the Paris Agreement and we have these voluntary targets, but meeting them doesn't achieve the Paris Agreement. And the SDGs are a mess. Again, I'll sort of put some stuff in the chat about why so much within the SDGs is counterproductive. And what's really awful about the SDGs in particular is that it explicitly separates climate change out from everything else in Goal 13. So there are some thoughts on why the SDGs are counterproductive, but they couldn't be better. And this is a sad aspect. What the SDGs do have is amazing. And if I were involved, I couldn't do better. I would probably do a lot worse. But if the best we can get is an absolute mess, there's a problem with the system. And we need to think well beyond the 2030 agenda. We need to think well beyond the SDGs Sendai and Paris. Because if we implemented the SDGs Sendai and Paris and a couple of other agreements within Agenda 2030, we still would not have enough. So that is sort of the real challenge.
Thank you, Ilan.
So yeah, disaster socially constructed, absolutely. There's an excellent message, key message, keep it up. Disaster warning system in the UK, especially landslide. As far as we've found, we're actually doing a report right now for a national body within the UK, which includes one of the people in the House of Lords. And we actually haven't found anything on landslide warning for the UK. So there's there's also not very good earthquake warning for the UK. So there's a lot of major issues with warning systems. We have reviewed warning systems in the UK and find they're very hazard focused. So each agency is responsible for its own warning, and it's based on hazard. There are also very fundamental issues that the technical aspects of warnings which exist in the UK are fabulous. Really world leading, so highly impressive. So whether it's the Meteorological Office, the Weather Office, or the Environment Agency of England and Wales, and many other systems, the technical aspects are actually, very few technical recommendations. We find that the information is there and people are very bad at responding to it. This is very much the missing link in warnings, which we're identifying for the UK and applies elsewhere. How do we get that technical information to be credible, to be trusted, to reach people when we have multiple languages and cultures, and to get them to act in a certain way? It's not helped by the government. The government has gone through about 5 different key warning messages for COVID-19. Every single one of them has been wrong. Even the latest one, they talk about, I think it's face, hands, space, as in cover your face, wash your hands, give people space, but it's the other way around. first give people space and wash your hands. And if you can't do that, then cover your face. If you're on a crowded underground train and everyone is washed their hands and everyone's covering their face, but you're crammed in, you're going to get a COVID outbreak. So even the very simple aspects of face, hand, space, the UK government got that simple part completely wrong. Should be space, hands, face. So it really isn't helped by the government. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, senior people breaking their own regulations. So yeah, we have a lot that we can offer regarding warnings, and we need a lot more. So please send us what you have.
Thank you, Ilan. We could stay with you for all day long, but it was marvelous. It was an amazing moment for us to stay with you in this morning for us, afternoon for you. It was a very huge pleasure listen to your ideas about disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, disasters, concepts, and so on. I think guys are finished this activity very more excited yet after your speech, and I think it's a first moment of that could be a partnership, a collaboration in soon, in the future soon. If you are interested, of course.
Yes,
So,
no, this is what we need.
Yeah.
Thank you people for coming, for your questions and comments. Always looking for ways to work together, but to learn from each other. This
Yeah.
cannot be me telling you, it's us telling each other.
Okay, thank you for that. I would like to highlight some persons in the audience. It was Ricardo Matos is a colleague from my university, and now a Center of Disaster Research. Amilcar is another colleague from Paraíba, from João Pessoa. I think you have been in Brazil, Ilan. What cities do you know here?
I was on Fernando de Noronha.
Yeah, the island. Yes, amazing.
Yes,
It's amazing.
we had a
place.
conference there. I do a lot of work on islands, and there was an island cultures conference there.
Wow, this is
So
important.
yeah, spent one night each way in Recife, but most of the time was Fernando de Noronha. So huge country, plenty more to see.
Wow, this is nice. Okay. Okay, other guys here, all guys from GLE School, thank you for staying here. This seminar is for you. Enjoy this moment, guys. This is important moment for us. It's a moment to improve our skills in English, in international way, point of views, and international views from disaster risk reduction. I think it's a very important moment for us. And I saw Professor from the Buenos Aires University. I think he is out. But Ilan, thank you so much for that. It was a very important moment. It was a very interesting discuss, and I think a lot of ideas are surging in our brain, in our mind right now. And then we enjoyed too much your speech, and thank you for your time, for your kindness, in all this stuff for today. Thank you.
Obrigado.
Tchau, pessoal. Next conference is in September 10, with Professor Jorn Bickman from Stuttgart University. Is another colleague from Germany. His speech will about integrating disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And then we could discuss a little more this subject in the next conference. Thanks a lot for you guys. Thanks, Ilan. Enjoy your weekend. Stay healthy at home if you could. And very soon we could stay in blood and in flesh to discuss a little more about disaster risk reduction. Tchau, tchau, pessoal. Até a próxima.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.